Welcome to Apex Storyteller, your haven for peaceful stories. If you enjoy these tales, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to help me share more with you and others in need of tranquility. Drop a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, settle into your space, close your eyes, and let's enjoy this relaxing experience together. Have you ever felt like a place was watching you? In a forgotten town stands a house no one dares to approach, its windows dark, its walls whispering secrets no one wants to hear. When Lucas and Amelia wandered too close, they felt it instantly, the cold, unshakable sense that something inside was waiting. The question is, would you step inside if the door opened for you on its own? The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery, a place left behind by time. Its empty streets and decaying buildings were the remnants of a once thriving community. At the center of it all stood the Blackwood House, a sprawling mansion cloaked in ivy, its windows darkened like dead eyes. The house was the heart of every whispered tale in the region, and it was said to have a mind of its own. Lucas had heard the stories growing up, stories of people who entered and never returned, of ghostly figures watching from the attic, and of a voice that would call out to visitors in the dead of night. He never believed any of it, not until the night he found the letter. It was late October, and the chill of autumn crept through the small apartment he shared with his sister, Amelia. She was the curious one, always digging through old books and local legends, piecing together forgotten histories. Lucas, on the other hand, was practical to a fault, dismissing her obsession with the paranormal as little more than a hobby. That night, the letter arrived in their mailbox, no return address, no stamp, just their names written in a jagged, almost childlike scrawl. To Lucas and Amelia. Come to the Blackwood House before midnight. The truth waits for you. Amelia's eyes lit up with curiosity as she read the note aloud. This has to be some kind of prank, Lucas muttered, tossing the letter onto the coffee table. But what if it's not, she replied, her voice tinged with excitement. Lucas rolled his eyes. You can't seriously be considering this. It's probably some kids messing around. Amelia crossed her arms. And if it's not? Lucas, you've heard the stories. What if this is our chance to finally know what's real? Her words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Fine. But if this turns out to be some elaborate joke, you're buying dinner for a week. By the time they reached Black Hollow, the sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving the town bathed in an eerie twilight. Their footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement as they approached the Blackwood House. It stood at the end of a narrow street, its towering silhouette casting long shadows. Lucas hesitated at the gate. Last chance to turn around, he said, half joking. Amelia smirked. You're scared, aren't you? Before Lucas could respond, the gate creaked open on its own. The sound sent a chill down his spine, but Amelia pressed forward without hesitation. The air grew colder as they stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front door. Lucas felt the weight of the house pressing down on him, like an invisible force trying to push him away. Amelia, however, seemed unfazed. When they reached the door, Amelia raised her hand to knock, but before she could, it swung open with a slow, groaning sound. Lucas froze. That's not normal, he whispered. Neither is getting an anonymous letter, Amelia replied, stepping inside. The interior of the house was as haunting as its exterior. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. A grand staircase loomed in the center of the foyer, its banister carved with intricate, almost otherworldly designs. As they ventured further inside, the sound of their footsteps seemed to grow louder, echoing through the empty halls. Lucas's nerves were on edge, every creak of the floorboards sending his heart racing. "I don't like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia ignored him, her attention drawn to a framed photograph on the wall. It was a black and white image of a family, parents and two children, all dressed in formal attire. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless, and yet their eyes seemed to follow Lucas and Amelia as they moved. "Look at this," Amelia said, pointing to the photograph. Lucas joined her, squinting at the image. "Creepy," he muttered. Suddenly, a soft noise broke the silence, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Lucas's blood ran cold. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Amelia nodded slowly. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but the words were impossible to make out. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Lucas grabbed her arm. "We should leave. Now!" Amelia pulled away. "No, we came here for answers. We're not leaving until we find out what's going on." Against his better judgment, Lucas followed her up the staircase. The whispers grew louder with each step, leading them to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing a faint, flickering light. "Amelia, this is a bad idea," Lucas said, his voice shaking. But Amelia pushed the door open. Inside, they found an old, wooden table with a single candle burning at its center. Surrounding the candle were more photographs, each one depicting Lucas and Amelia at various stages of their lives. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. "What the hell is this?" Before Amelia could respond, the door slammed shut behind them. The whisper stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that echoed through the room. "Welcome home." The door slammed shut with a force that made the walls tremble, the sound echoing through the hollow, oppressive silence of the room. For a moment, Lucas and Amelia stood frozen in place, staring at the door as if expecting it to open again. But it didn't. "Did you hear that?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. His heart hammered in his chest, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet felt as though they were cemented to the floor. Amelia didn't respond at first. She was too busy scanning the room. The walls were lined with strange, ornate carvings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, like they were watching them. But the photographs in the center of the room, the ones scattered around the candle, were what held her attention. They were all pictures of them. Lucas and Amelia. The first photo was from a family vacation years ago. The second was from a Christmas gathering last year. But the third one was taken just hours earlier, in front of their apartment building. They hadn't taken any photos there. No one had been around to capture the moment. "What the hell?" Lucas muttered, his voice breaking. Amelia picked up one of the photos, her fingers trembling. "How is this even possible? We didn't take these pictures." As her fingers brushed the edge of the photo, the candle's flame flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. The room seemed to darken further, the once gentle glow of the flame now casting an unnatural, blood-red hue. The whispering started again, soft at first, like a breeze brushing against the back of their necks. But this time, the voices were clearer, sharper. You shouldn't have come. Amelia dropped the photo in shock, the sound of it hitting the floor breaking the spell. Lucas's heart raced, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked at Amelia, who now seemed just as shaken, her face pale, her eyes white with fear. "We have to get out of here," Lucas said, his voice unsteady. But before he could take a step toward the door, the whispering escalated into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but undeniably urgent. "Run. Leave. You'll never leave." The air grew thicker, suffocating. Lucas felt like he couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, his legs shaking. He grabbed Amelia's arm, pulling her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had locked them in. "What's happening?" Amelia gasped, trying to pry the door open with all her strength, but it wouldn't move. It was like the house was alive, a presence that was aware of their every move. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the room, though the windows were shut tight. The flickering candlelight cast twisted, monstrous shapes on the walls, and for a brief moment, Lucas thought he saw something standing in the doorway, something too dark to be human. He blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling with terror. Amelia nodded, her eyes white with fear. There was something there, something watching us. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, they heard it, a low, rumbling growl, like something far below the floors was waking up. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the walls groaning with the sound of something ancient stirring. "Run!" The voice now came from directly behind them, a sharp whisper that sent a cold shiver down their spines. Before they could react, a shadow darted across the room, a figure, tall and grotesque, moving too fast to catch in the dim light. It seemed to reach out for them, but Lucas yanked Amelia's arm, pulling her toward the door again, his pulse racing. They both shoved against the door with all their might, and this time, it creaked open, just enough for them to slip through. But as they stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped dramatically. A chill unlike anything they had ever felt crept into their bones, and the air was so cold that Lucas could see his breath. The house groaned around them, like it was coming to life, like it was waking up after a long slumber. Amelia was ahead of him now, moving quickly but cautiously down the hallway, her eyes scanning every dark corner. "Where do we go now?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with panic. But before Amelia could answer, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the floor above. Someone or something was walking through the house. The footsteps were heavy, unnatural, like they belonged to something that didn't quite belong in the human world. "They're here." The voice was back, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. "They're all here." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Lucas felt his body freeze, his heart beating so loudly that it drowned out everything else. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Amelia grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "We need to get out, now." They both turned and ran down the hallway, toward the stairs. But as they reached the bottom of the staircase, the front door slammed shut, trapping them inside once again. Amelia tried to open it, pulling with all her might, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation flooded her face as she struggled against the door. In the distance, they heard it again, the sound of footsteps, getting closer. But this time, there was something more. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the walls, like a creature waiting to feast. They were not alone. The owls had awoken, and it was hungry. The door slammed shut with a force that made the entire house shudder. Amelia and Lucas froze, eyes wide, hearts pounding in their chests. The sound echoed in the hallway, reverberating like the final warning of something much darker than the house itself. Lucas tried the handle again, pushing against the door with all his strength, but it didn't budge. It felt as if the owls had made its decision. They were staying. What's happening? Amelia gasped, her voice quivering as she backed away from the door. Her eyes darted around the darkened hallway, searching for something, anything that could explain the sudden, suffocating feeling that hung in the air. Lucas's pulse hammered in his ears. I don't know, but we need to get out. We shouldn't have come in here. He didn't finish his sentence. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hall from the same direction they had come. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were multiple. Soft, dragging, the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving through the darkness. Amelia's face drained of color. It's coming for us. Lucas turned toward the staircase, every instinct telling him to run, but his legs felt like lead. His body refused to move. He could hear the footsteps growing closer, almost as if whatever was making them had been waiting for them to make the first move. Amelia, Lucas whispered hoarsely, grabbing her arm. Stay close. We need to find another way out. But Amelia wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on something down the hallway, a shadow moving unnaturally. She took a step forward, her breath shallow, her voice barely a whisper. Lucas. I think it's in the walls. What? Lucas breathed, his stomach churning. It's in the walls. I can hear it scratching. It's in the woodwork, in the floors. It's been here for a long time. Suddenly, the scraping noise stopped. The owls fell deathly silent, and the footsteps ceased. A chill ran down Lucas's spine as he looked around, the air growing colder by the second. He could almost feel something watching them, something unseen, its gaze heavy, suffocating. Then, from the dark hallway ahead, the voice returned. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to vibrate through his skull. You can't escape. It was different this time. There was something more terrifying about it, something in the voice that scraped at his very soul. The house is hungry. It waits for you. Before Lucas could even respond, Amelia let out a sharp cry, stumbling back against the wall. The shadows seemed to move, almost like they were alive, shifting and slithering toward her. Lucas grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the encroaching darkness. We have to go now. Lucas hissed. He didn't wait for her to respond. He could hear the scraping sound again, louder this time. Whatever it was closer. Much closer. The air around them was so thick now that it felt as if they were suffocating. Every breath felt like it was drawn from a place far deeper than the lungs, as if the very walls of the house were choking them. The house creaked. The walls groaned. It was alive in a way that no house should ever be. Lucas, look. Amelia cried, her voice filled with disbelief and terror. She pointed toward the far end of the hallway, her finger trembling as she reached out. Lucas's heart stopped. At the far end of the hall, just before the staircase, stood a figure. It was tall, far too tall for any normal person. Its limbs were twisted in unnatural angles, its skin an ashen, decayed gray. It had no face, only a hollow, dark void where its features should have been. And the worst part? It was staring directly at them, or at least, Lucas thought it was. It didn't move, but it seemed to pull the light toward it, as if the darkness itself was drawn to this thing. Amelia's voice was barely audible. "What is that?" Lucas didn't wait to find out. He yanked her toward the nearest door, slamming it open. The room beyond was pitch black, but the door slammed shut behind them just as quickly. They were trapped again. The sound of scraping against the walls, the low growl in the distance, it was all too much. They were in the house now, and the house knew it. Amelia fumbled for her phone, but the screen remained black. "It's dead," she whispered in disbelief. She had a moment of panic, her hand shaking violently. "How is this happening? This place doesn't make sense." Lucas tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. He cursed under his breath, banging on it with his fists. The air was stifling now. Every breath they took felt colder than the last. He had to think there had to be a way out. Suddenly, the candle in the corner of the room flickered. Then it went out completely. The darkness pressed in from all sides, as if the owls were devouring the light. The shadows seemed to grow taller, stretching toward them, twisting like living creatures. And then, from the pitch-black corner of the room, a voice spoke. "You'll never leave." It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was cold, full of malice, and so close that Lucas felt it crawl under his skin. He spun around, but saw nothing. The scratching grew louder again, this time from all sides, coming from the walls, the ceiling, beneath their feet. The house itself seemed to be breathing, the wood creaking and groaning like something alive and ravenous. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he realized they weren't alone anymore. "Amelia, we need to find a way out now," he shouted, his voice sharp with panic. But Amelia didn't respond. She was staring, wide-eyed, at something just beyond Lucas. Her body was stiff, frozen with fear. He turned, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the same figure, the faceless, shadowy entity. It wasn't standing anymore. It was moving toward them, its limbs swaying unnaturally with each step. The room seemed to grow darker the closer it came, as if the very light around them was being consumed by its presence. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He was too afraid to move. Too afraid to even scream. All he could do was watch as the thing drew closer, its empty void of a face turning toward him. The air around them turned icy cold. His entire body froze. Amelia was trembling beside him, but her eyes were locked on the figure, unable to look away. And then, in a voice that was not a voice at all, it whispered again, "You're mine." Suddenly, the world went black. Darkness swallowed them whole. It wasn't just the kind of darkness you could see. It was a tangible, oppressive presence. As if the house itself had turned off all the lights in their minds, leaving them in a void, disconnected from everything they knew. Lucas could still hear the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged, but beyond that, nothing made sense. "Lucas, are you still here?" Amelia's voice trembled in the suffocating blackness. It was the only thing that reminded him they were still together in this nightmare. "I'm here," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the silence itself would swallow his words. But no sooner had he spoken, the air shifted. The temperature dropped even further, colder than it had been before, until Lucas could see his own breath condense in front of him. Something was wrong. It was the kind of cold that burned. Every inch of his skin felt raw, as though it was being sliced open by invisible blades. He shivered, instinctively moving closer to Amelia. Her body was tense beside him, her heartbeat so fast that it was almost audible in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their ragged breaths in the dark. Then, in the far corner of the room, a soft scraping noise began, slow, methodical, like the gnawing of a creature desperate to find a way in. Lucas felt his chest tighten. The sound echoed in his skull, reverberating through the bones in his body. It was coming closer. No! 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 He instinctively reached out to grab Amelia's hand, but when his fingers brushed against hers, she flinched, as if she hadn't recognized his touch. Something had changed in her. Something was wrong with her, too. The fear in the air was contagious, creeping into their veins like poison. "Amelia," he whispered urgently, his voice thick with dread. "What's happening?" There was no response. For a moment, all he could hear was the gnawing of the darkness. Then, to his horror, he heard it, a low, guttural voice, barely more than a whisper, like it was speaking directly into his mind. "Don't worry. It's just beginning." The words were cold and hollow, an emptiness that echoed like a warning, one that made every hair on Lucas's body stand on end. He turned to Amelia, but she was still frozen in place, her body unnaturally stiff. "Amelia, talk to me." Lucas's voice cracked as he shook her, but it was like he was shaking a statue. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something in the darkness. "Please, Amelia." The scraping sound in the corner intensified, now accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Lucas's eyes darted to the corner where the noise came from. Slowly, painfully slow, he watched as the shadows began to twist and shift. They seemed to move on their own, as if the room itself was alive, contorting like something that didn't want to be seen. Something was in that corner. With every passing second, the shadows deepened. The darkness gathered, as if forming into a shape, a silhouette of something that wasn't human. Lucas's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. His feet were glued to the floor, as though the house itself was holding him in place. The figure in the corner began to take form. It was tall, impossibly tall. The shadows wrapped around it like a shroud, but Lucas could still make out its shape: long, twisted limbs, too many joints, and something that could have been a face, but it was so contorted that it defied recognition. The figure's head tilted unnaturally far to the side, as if it were studying them, deciding how best to approach. Then, in a voice that was far too close for comfort, the creature whispered, "You can't hide from what's inside." Lucas's blood ran cold. He couldn't even think straight anymore. The only thing that mattered was getting out of here. He turned toward the door, desperate, frantic, but it was gone. The doorway had disappeared. He was trapped in the dark with that thing. "Amelia!" he screamed, his throat raw. He shook her again, harder this time. Finally, she moved, jerked back to life with a gasp, her hands gripping his arms as if pulling herself from a trance. She blinked rapidly, as if waking from a deep sleep, her eyes wide with confusion. What happened? Her voice was hoarse, trembling. Where are we? What's going on? Lucas didn't have time to explain. We have to get out. Now! He pulled her toward the wall, desperately searching for any way out of this nightmare. But then, Amelia stopped, her hand gripping Lucas's arm with an iron-like force. Her eyes, white with terror, locked onto something in the corner, the same spot where the shadow had formed. Lucas followed her gaze, his heart stopping when he saw it. The figure was closer now. No longer a silhouette, it was standing only a few feet away from them, its form unmistakably clear. Its eyes, empty black holes, seemed to consume everything around them. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. The air felt suffocating, thick with the weight of its presence. Amelia let out a choked sob. It's going to kill us, isn't it? The creature's head tilted again, its long, bony fingers curling. And then, it whispered, this time loud enough for them both to hear, its voice like the scraping of metal against stone. Not yet. The shadows around them grew deeper, tighter, until Lucas felt as though they were closing in on him. The temperature dropped further. He couldn't breathe. There was something about the way it was staring at them, something predatory in its gaze, like it was savoring their fear. You're in my house now. The creature spoke again, its voice a mixture of whispers and hissing sounds. And once you're inside, you never leave. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as panic set in. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. Amelia's grip tightened on his arm, but even she looked helpless, like she couldn't move, like her body was being held by an invisible force. The creature didn't need to touch them. The house itself was a prison, and the more they struggled, the more they sank into its dark embrace. But then, just as Lucas thought he might suffocate under the weight of it all, the creature's voice echoed one last time. The game has just begun. The room suddenly exploded with a deafening crash, splintering wood, groaning walls, and an almost animal-like roar that filled the air. The floor shook beneath their feet, the sound of something or someone banging against the walls, trying to break free. And then, the silence returned. But now, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of something. Something waiting. The silence that followed was not a relief. It was a vacuum, like everything around them had been sucked out, leaving only emptiness, only fear. Lucas could feel his pulse thumping in his throat, each beat loud enough to drown out everything else. His body trembled, but not from the cold anymore. This was pure terror. Amelia was still gripping his arm, her fingers like ice, her breath shallow and erratic. She was staring ahead, not moving, her face pale as if she were seeing something he couldn't. Amelia. Lucas whispered, trying to bring her back to him, trying to shake her out of the trance she seemed to be in. But she didn't respond. She was fixated, eyes wide, pupils dilated. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. It was like the air itself had thickened. It felt harder to breathe, heavier, like each breath was being pulled out of his lungs. Lucas wanted to move, wanted to break free, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. It was as if the house was holding him in place, unwilling to let him go. He turned to look around, scanning the room, searching for any way out. But there was nothing. The walls felt close, pressing in on them, the shadows stretching impossibly long. The small, flickering light from a cracked lamp by the window was the only thing that illuminated the room, but even that seemed to be struggling against the darkness. Then, from the corner of the room, the scraping noise started again. It was subtle at first, like the sound of nails dragging across a chalkboard, sharp, grating, and just loud enough to make Lucas's skin crawl. His heart skipped a beat. The creature was still there. It hadn't gone. It was still watching, still waiting. Amelia. His voice was hoarse now, panic seeping into his every word. We need to move. We need to leave right now. But she still didn't respond. She wasn't even blinking. Her face was fixed, a mask of horror that seemed to grow deeper with each passing second. Her eyes darted towards the far corner, where the darkness was thickest, and Lucas followed her gaze. What he saw made his stomach twist. The shadow in the corner wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was moving, shifting. It wasn't a part of the room, it was a thing, alive, breathing in the silence. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, growing and shrinking, like it was feeding off the tension in the room. Lucas's mind raced, his pulse quickening. That thing was alive. But more than that, it was hunting them. Amelia, please. Lucas pleaded again, shaking her, his fingers digging into her arms. But still, nothing. No response. She was beyond him now, lost in the world of the shadows, trapped in the web of the house. The scraping sound grew louder. Closer. It wasn't just in the corner now, it was everywhere. It was inside the walls. It was under the floorboards. It was in the very air they breathed, crawling into their minds, slipping into their ears like a whisper. It was everywhere. Lucas's chest tightened, his throat closing. It wasn't just a thing in the corner anymore. It was the house itself. He realized with a sickening certainty that the house wasn't just haunted. The house was the monster. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, it was all part of something that was alive, breathing and waiting. Then the voice came again. A voice so low, so guttural, it seemed to come from deep within the house itself. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was like a rasping breath in his ear, right beside his face. It was so close he could feel the chill of it on his skin. He spun around, expecting to see the creature there, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty air. And yet, he knew it was watching him. He could feel its eyes on him, could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on his shoulders, suffocating him. You're mine now. Lucas's heart hammered against his chest. It wasn't just speaking to him. It was speaking to his very soul. He could feel it. Its words were not just words. They were poison. A slow, creeping dread that seeped into every part of him, filling him with the sensation of being trapped in a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. The floor beneath them groaned. Lucas staggered, nearly losing his footing, and Amelia jolted at the sudden movement. For the first time since they had entered the house, she blinked. Her eyes locked onto him with a faint spark of recognition, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the same fearful, vacant stare. Amelia! We need to get out of here, he shouted. His voice cracked under the pressure, his desperation bleeding through. But she was still frozen, her eyes fixed on something he couldn't see. It was as though she were in a trance, following the movement of something invisible. Something dangerous. The scraping noise stopped. And in the stillness that followed, Lucas thought he heard something else. Something deeper, darker, a low, almost rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat coming from beneath their feet. It was slow at first, but it grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from under the house. The walls vibrated with the sound. The floor trembled beneath him. And then, suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath them, splitting like a wound being torn open. The room collapsed around them. Lucas didn't have time to react. The floor gave way, and they were falling, plunging into the darkness, into the endless void that seemed to stretch beneath the house, an abyss that no one could escape. His heart pounded in his ears, his body weightless in the fall. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in a roaring silence. And then, with a sickening jolt, they landed. The darkness enveloped them, pressing in on every side. It felt like the world was closing in, suffocating them. Lucas pushed himself up, scrambling to find some solid ground, but the darkness was everywhere. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was alive, it was watching. Amelia had stopped moving. She lay motionless beside him, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. And then, as if to answer his thoughts, a new voice echoed from deep within the shadows. "Welcome home." The voice wasn't human. It was cold, ancient, and it was everywhere. And Lucas knew, with a certainty that gripped his very soul, that they weren't alone. They were never alone. Lucas could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. Every breath he took felt like a struggle against something unseen, something that was watching, waiting. The words from the voice still rang in his ears, "Welcome home." They felt like a curse, a chilling welcome that only confirmed what he feared most. Amelia was still motionless beside him, her eyes wide, her face pale as death itself. Her lips barely moved, a faint whisper escaping from them. "Get out of here." The words were barely audible, a plea that seemed to get lost in the cold air. Her hand twitched, as if trying to reach for something, but then fell limp again. Lucas's heart raced. He shook her gently, but she didn't respond, her body as cold as the ground they lay on. His mind was reeling, panic setting in, but he forced himself to focus. He had to get her out of here. He had to find a way to escape the nightmare that had trapped them. The air around them seemed to vibrate with an unnatural hum, like the house itself was alive with malice. The walls were closing in, their darkened contours warping as if they were made of something far more sinister than brick and wood. They didn't belong here. None of it did. As he looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings, the shadows in the distance seemed to move. Not in the way a normal shadow would, stretching or shifting with the light. These shadows had a mind of their own, creeping and slithering along the walls, as if they were alive. His stomach turned, but he couldn't look away. The deep, rhythmic thumping that had haunted them earlier, thump, 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 was back, louder now, almost deafening. It came from somewhere deep beneath the floor, as though the house was breathing, exhaling something dark and terrible from within. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was paralyzed by the sheer presence of whatever was in this place. Then, the air grew colder, much colder, and the thumping sound shifted. It no longer came from beneath them. It was in the walls now. The sound was coming from every direction, vibrating through the floorboards, echoing in his chest, rattling his bones. "Amelia!" Lucas hissed, his voice trembling. But she was unresponsive. The distance between them felt like miles now, as though whatever this place was, it was separating them even more. His mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and a sense of impending doom that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The shadows in the room grew longer, darker, more defined. One by one, they detached from the walls and started to move toward him. Lucas's breath hitched in his throat as one shadow stretched out, its form becoming more distinct, more solid. The darkness within it swirled, twisting like smoke. And then, it spoke. The voice was not one voice, but many whispering, chanting, murmuring in a language Lucas couldn't understand. The words felt like claws scraping at his skin, like the sound of 100 nails dragging across glass. You shouldn't have come. The voice was distorted, no longer human. It felt ancient, as if it had been echoing through this house for centuries, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander into its reach. The shadows twisted again, this time faster, rushing toward him in an unstoppable tide. Panic surged through him, and he finally found his legs, scrambling to his feet. His pulse thundered in his ears, and the world around him seemed to spiral, losing all sense of reality. But no matter how fast he moved, the shadows were always there, always close. He reached out, desperately trying to grab Amelia, but the shadows were pulling her away. Their cold touch seemed to tear at his skin as he grabbed her arm, trying to lift her, but her body was like a stone, unyielding. He could feel the energy draining from him, his strength waning with each second. Amelia! Wake up, he shouted, shaking her harder now. Her eyelids fluttered open for a split second, but her eyes were empty, lost to the abyss that surrounded them. And then, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the darkest corner of the room. It was draped in shadow, its face obscured by the darkness that clung to it like a cloak. But Lucas didn't need to see its face to know what it was. The very air around him seemed to grow colder, more oppressive, as if it had just stepped into the room. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, its every step resonating with an unnatural weight. The thumping sound continued, louder now, the rhythm more pronounced. And then it spoke. You're too late. The voice was deep, echoing through the room like a growl, sending chills down Lucas's spine. It was the same voice that had welcomed them, the same voice that had haunted him since the moment they entered the house. The figure stepped forward, its feet barely touching the floor as if it was hovering, gliding toward him with an unnatural grace. Lucas's heart raced, his blood running cold. His body was frozen in place, caught in the grip of fear so strong it seemed to paralyze him. The shadows around him twisted and writhed, reaching for him like hands that wanted to pull him into the abyss. In a last-ditch effort, Lucas turned toward the only possible escape, the window. But the moment he glanced at it, he realized that the window was no longer there. The walls had shifted, closing off any chance of escape. They were trapped. There was nowhere to go. The figure took another step, and Lucas could hear the sound of bones cracking, as if it was walking on the very bones of the house itself. It was coming closer. Lucas's breath was shallow, his chest tightening. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, colder, more suffocating with each passing second. Leave, now, Amelia whispered weakly, her voice barely audible, but Lucas could hear the desperation in it. She was still with him, still fighting, but he didn't know how much longer she could hold on. But it was too late. The figure was upon them, towering over him, its cold breath brushing against his skin. Lucas closed his eyes, bracing for whatever came next, but then everything stopped. The room fell silent, the thumping ceased, the shadows stilled. For a moment, Lucas thought he had died. But then he realized that this silence wasn't a relief. It was worse. It was unnatural. Something was wrong, something that defied all logic and reason. And then the voice whispered again, "You're already a part of me." And that's when it hit him. They were never leaving. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as the icy silence closed in around him. Each beat echoed like a war drum, but the sound was drowned by the suffocating quiet of the house, as if the very walls were conspiring to keep him from hearing his own thoughts. He could feel a cold, unnatural weight in the air, an invisible hand pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't the physical pressure that truly terrified him. No, it was the overwhelming feeling that something was watching him. The figure, the one that had haunted him since he stepped foot into this forsaken house, was no longer just a shadow at the edges of his vision. It was here, in front of him, towering over him. He could feel its presence, like the dark breath of something ancient and malevolent. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if it existed between dimensions, a form that could shift at will, never fully solid, never fully real. A thing that shouldn't exist, but did. Lucas's eyes desperately searched the room, trying to focus on something, anything, to ground him. He needed to get out, to escape. But the house had turned into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The once familiar walls, the dusty furniture, the creaking floorboards, they had all warped, bent, and twisted, taking on a dark, sickly aura. The very air was thick, sticky, like he was swimming through some viscous nightmare. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The floor creaked ominously beneath its weight, a deep, resonating sound that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. The sound of it made his entire body freeze, his muscles locking in place. He wanted to scream, but no sound left his throat. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy, the terror squeezing the words right out of him. "Do you feel it?" The voice spoke directly into his mind, not through his ears, but inside his skull. Cold. Alien. Evil. The house is alive now, Lucas. Alive because of you. Alive because of all of you. His breath hitched, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. It knows my name. He tried to step back, to break free from the invisible chains that held him in place, but his legs refused to move. His body was betraying him, locked in place as if it had become part of the house itself. His hands, trembling, reached for Amelia, still lying motionless on the floor, her eyes barely open, the faintest flicker of recognition in them. Her lips moved, but the words she spoke were barely a whisper. "Run, Lucas, it's already too late." Too late. What did she mean? Panic surged through his chest. What does she know that I don't? His mind spun, his thoughts jumbled, but one thing became clear in the haze of terror. Amelia knew something more. She had been here longer, trapped in the house's grip, and now he was caught in the same cycle. The figure was closer now, almost towering over him. Lucas could see it more clearly than before, a face that wasn't quite a face, but a gaping void of darkness, a grotesque mockery of human form. Its eyes were black holes that seemed to pull the light from the room, its grin wide and jagged, filled with rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. The shadows around it twisted, reaching toward him like tendrils, grasping, pulling. He could feel their icy touch, colder than the house itself, cold enough to freeze his very soul. His body screamed in protest, but his mind was too fogged with fear to act. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was beside him. He could feel its cold, clammy breath on his neck, sending a wave of disgust through his body. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the horror inside him only grew stronger, more visceral. "You are already part of me," the voice whispered again, inside his skull. "You always were. You just didn't know it yet." It was like the voice was slipping into his very thoughts, speaking things that only he knew. His deepest, darkest fears, his regrets, his moments of weakness, they all flooded his mind. It was as if the house could see inside him, as if it had known every part of him long before he even walked through the door. His eyes locked on Amelia again. She was still lying there, her breath shallow, barely a whisper of life left in her. She reached out weakly with one hand, her fingers brushing the floor, trying to move, trying to speak. But her words were no longer audible. The figure extended one skeletal hand toward him, the shadows writhing around it like a living thing. It reached for his face, and in that instant, Lucas felt his body betraying him once more. His skin crawled as the figure's fingers made contact. The cold was unbearable. The darkness seeped into his skin, as if it were sucking the life from him. His vision blurred, and in those fleeting moments of half-consciousness, he saw flashes. Faces twisted in terror, their eyes wide and empty, staring into the void. They were the others, the ones who had come before them. And now, they were a part of the house, their souls forever trapped within the walls. A horrific realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. They weren't the first ones to come here. They wouldn't be the last either. This house was a living thing, and it fed on those who entered, slowly devouring their very souls until there was nothing left. He could feel it now, the pull of the darkness, the suffocating grip tightening around him. He was being dragged into the void, into a place where time had no meaning, where only suffering existed. The shadows twisted, contorted, and for a moment, Lucas felt himself fall. His body seemed to sink into the very floor beneath him, like the house was swallowing him whole. He tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed his voice, his mind, everything. And then it stopped. Everything went still. The cold, the darkness, the figure. For a moment, Lucas thought he had died, that everything was over. But then he heard it, a voice, soft but unmistakable. "Welcome home." It was Amelia's voice. But there was something wrong. It wasn't her anymore. The sound was hollow, echoing in his mind like a memory that didn't belong to him. The darkness that had consumed him had not ended. It had only begun. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed those before him. There was no escape, no freedom. His soul was bound to the house now, part of its endless, writhing nightmare. And the truth was undeniable. He wasn't a victim anymore. He had become one of them, a part of the house. And as his senses faded, as his body dissolved into the very air around him, he realized the horrifying truth. The house had never been abandoned. It had only been waiting for him, waiting for them. The others had always been a part of it, as would he. And now, like all the others, Lucas's name would forever be etched into the walls of this house. His story would remain eternal, endless, just as the house itself. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the house, his voice would echo forevermore. Forever home. Second story. Imagine buying a house on the border of the USA and Mexico, a beautiful place surrounded by nothing but desert and silence. That's exactly what Ethan thought when he moved in. But from the moment he stepped through the door, something didn't feel right. The house seemed to breathe, its walls groaned at night, whispers echoed through the halls, and shadows moved where they shouldn't. Then, one night, Ethan found a hidden room behind the wall in the basement. And in that room, an old journal with a chilling message: some doors should never be opened. Now, Ethan is trapped, and every time he tries to leave, the house seems to pull him back. What's waiting for him behind those walls? Let's dive into the next terrifying chapter of Ethan's descent into madness. Ethan had always wanted a place to call his own. He was tired of living in crowded cities, surrounded by people who never seemed to understand him. So, when he found a house on the edge of the desert, right on the border of the USA and Mexico, he thought it was the perfect escape. It was secluded, quiet, and miles away from the chaos of everyday life. A fresh start, he told himself. He could finally find peace. The house itself was an old, sprawling ranch-style property with faded white paint and a cracked red-tiled roof. Despite its age, it had a certain charm: arched windows, a wide porch with a few rocking chairs, and a spacious backyard that stretched endlessly into the desert. Ethan had driven past this place countless times during his road trips, always wondering what lay behind its rusted gates. But now, it was his. And for the first few days, he enjoyed the peace, the isolation, the complete silence at night, except for the occasional sound of wind sweeping across the desert. But it wasn't long before he noticed something strange. The house seemed to groan. At first, he dismissed it as the natural settling of an old building, but the noises became more frequent. Floorboards creaked when he was alone, doors slammed shut without explanation, and sometimes he could have sworn he heard footsteps upstairs when no one was there. On the fourth night, the silence was broken by a loud bang, like something heavy had dropped. Ethan shot upright in bed, his heart pounding. He looked around the dark room, his eyes straining to make out shapes in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. Nothing. There was no sign of movement. He grabbed his flashlight from the bedside table and, with a nervous breath, ventured downstairs. The house was still. Too still. The faint smell of old wood and dust seemed to cling to the air, making him feel suffocated. As he moved down the hallway, the creaks of the floor beneath his feet sounded unnaturally loud. Every step felt like it echoed through the walls, but the house remained eerily quiet. The sound hadn't come from the upstairs, Ethan was sure of it. It had come from the basement. He hesitated at the foot of the stairs, the idea of going down there unsettling him more than he wanted to admit. The basement door was an old wooden one, covered in chipped paint, and it had always felt wrong. But tonight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him down there. He walked over to the door, hesitating only for a moment before pushing it open. The hinges screeched loudly, and the smell of mildew hit him like a slap to the face. He flicked on the flashlight and peered down into the darkness. The stairs led to a dimly lit basement, filled with boxes, old furniture, and broken appliances that had long been abandoned. It was just a storage area, or at least that's what he thought. But as he descended, a cold draft seemed to rush past him, and he felt a strange pull to the back of the room, where the shadows seemed deeper, darker. His flashlight flickered as he walked further in, the beam catching the edges of old furniture and crates. And then he saw it. A door. It was small, tucked into the corner of the room behind a stack of old wooden crates. It looked out of place, as though it didn't belong there. The door was made of thick, dark wood, and unlike the rest of the basement, it was in pristine condition. There were no cobwebs, no dust. In fact, it almost looked new. But the feeling it gave him was anything but reassuring. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stepped closer. He reached out, his hand trembling, and tried the handle. It turned easily, creaking slightly as the door opened. Beyond it was a small room, hidden away from the rest of the house. A room he was certain hadn't existed when he first moved in. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty. But on the floor, in the center of the room, was something that sent a chill down his spine. An old journal. It was leather-bound, worn and faded, as if it had been sitting there for decades. The journal was open, resting face down, as though someone had left it there in a hurry. Ethan's curiosity was piqued. Who would leave a journal like this, hidden away behind a door no one had ever seen? His fingers brushed against the pages, the rough texture sending a shiver through him. The first thing he noticed was the writing. It wasn't in a neat, controlled hand, it was wild, frantic. And the words that caught his eye were the ones that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The past never leaves. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He read the words again, his mind racing. What did they mean? Who wrote this? And why was it left here, in this hidden room, in a house that was supposed to be empty? The sound of the door slamming shut behind him startled him, and he spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The basement had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, as if someone was standing just out of view. And that's when he heard it, a whisper. Low, soft, and unmistakable. Leave. Before it's too late. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew in that moment that whatever was hidden in this house, whatever had been locked away for so long, was waking up. And it was calling to him. The whisper echoed in Ethan's ears, a cold, unsettling sound that seemed to come from all around him. His body stiffened, and his mind raced. Leave. Before it's too late. The words were like a warning, a plea, but who or what was asking him to leave? And why? He stood there, motionless, his hands still gripping the leather-bound journal. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if they were creeping toward him. He could feel the air grow heavier, colder, thicker, almost suffocating. Then, without warning, the whispers began again. This time, there was no mistaking them. The voices were low and indistinct, overlapping one another like a chorus of distant, tortured souls. Ethan couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. His heartbeat thudded in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. He had to get out. He knew that now. Whatever was happening here, it was too much. He had to leave the house, leave the town, before things got worse. He turned to make his way back to the door, but as his foot hit the first step, the lights above him flickered violently. The basement plunged into darkness, the flashlight in his hand the only source of light. He fumbled with it, his hand shaking, but it flickered, threatening to die out. He cursed under his breath, desperate to get back to the safety of the hallway. That's when he heard it. A scraping noise. Slow, deliberate. It started faintly, like something dragging across the floor, but then it grew louder, closer, until it was right behind him. Ethan spun around, his heart in his throat. The flashlight illuminated the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to grow even darker. The scraping noise came from there, now unmistakably clear, a jagged sound, like nails being dragged across metal. He took a few quick steps back, his chest tightening. He wasn't alone. Something was in the room with him. He wasn't imagining it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his stomach churned with dread. What the hell is happening here? He thought, his mind spinning. The flashlight flickered again and finally went out, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to turn it back on, but there was no light. It was as if the house itself was conspiring to keep him in the dark. Suddenly, he heard a soft, low growl, like something trying to suppress a noise. Ethan froze. The growl came from directly in front of him, though he could see nothing in the pitch-black room. His heart hammered in his chest. His breath was coming in shallow gasps, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, but his body refused to move. Then, a voice broke through the silence, a voice so low, so guttural, that it made Ethan's blood run cold. Leave. Now. Ethan didn't wait for another warning. He turned and bolted for the stairs, his feet pounding against the wooden floor, his breath ragged in his throat. But as he reached the door, he felt someone grab his ankle. He screamed, his voice echoing off the basement walls, but there was no one there. Just a cold, icy grip that seemed to freeze his leg in place, dragging him back toward the darkness. With all the strength he could muster, Ethan kicked out, and the grip released. He scrambled up the stairs, not caring that the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He ran, his pulse racing, every part of his body screaming at him to get out, to escape the terror that lurked in the house. He stumbled into the kitchen, gasping for breath, his heart still pounding in his ears. The house was silent again, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm, as if something terrible was about to happen. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the hallway. But there was nothing. For a moment, Ethan stood there, his mind a blur, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The basement, the journal, the whispers, it didn't make sense. This wasn't some old house with a few creaks and groans. Something far more sinister was at play. The voices from the basement still echoed in his mind. The past never leaves. What had that meant? What had he stumbled upon here? And why had the house chosen him? Why was he being drawn into this nightmare? The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and a cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The quiet had returned, but the sense of dread remained. Something was coming. Something he couldn't escape. He glanced back at the staircase leading to the basement. The door was still shut, but he could feel the temptation to go back, to find out what had been hidden in the dark corners of the house. It was as if the house itself was calling to him, urging him to come closer. But Ethan knew better. He couldn't go back. Not yet. He needed to leave. But as his hand reached for the front door, a soft voice whispered in his ear once more. It's too late now. Ethan's hand hovered over the door handle, his pulse quickening with every passing second. The soft whisper that had come from behind him, "It's too late now," repeated in his mind like a mantra, sending waves of dread crashing over him. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, wouldn't leave him. He tried to shake it off, forcing his hand to grip the door handle. He was leaving. That was it. The house had become a prison, a nightmare he couldn't explain, and it was time to walk away. He couldn't stay here anymore. He didn't care about the price of the house or the mess it would make to leave. Something inside him screamed to get as far away as possible. But the door wouldn't open. He pulled harder, his breath coming in short gasps. The door was locked. But how? He hadn't locked it. He'd never even touched it since he moved in. Panic surged within him, and he spun around, trying to make sense of everything. The house had been quiet again, too quiet. The type of silence that wasn't peaceful. It felt suffocating, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, there was a faint sound, just barely perceptible, coming from upstairs. A creak. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. There was no one upstairs. He was alone in the house. The whispers, the voices, the shadows, they were all just in his head. Weren't they? Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He had to face this. He had to know what was in the house, what was following him. He couldn't run anymore. Not from the truth. He turned toward the stairs, each step feeling like an eternity as he ascended slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps continued, dragging across the floor above him in a slow, deliberate pattern. They weren't normal sounds. They were heavy. They echoed in a way that felt unnatural, like the house itself was groaning beneath the weight of something far worse than the physical. As he reached the top of the stairs, he froze. At the far end of the hall was a door that had never been there before. It was black, its edges rough and jagged, as though it had been hastily placed there. The air around it felt wrong, colder than the rest of the house. He didn't know why, but he felt an undeniable pull toward it, like it was calling to him. The door was slightly ajar, and the faintest hint of movement could be seen through the crack. Something was inside. Something waiting. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave, but his feet refused to listen. His legs carried him forward as if some invisible force was guiding him. He reached the door, pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The room was small, barely larger than a closet. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, but there was something else. Something he couldn't quite place. A cold, ancient presence seemed to linger in the air, as though it had been waiting for him. And then he saw it. A mirror. It was standing against the far wall, covered in a thick layer of grime. The glass was cracked, with jagged edges that seemed to distort the reflection in strange ways. Ethan couldn't look away. The mirror seemed to draw him in, like it was alive, its surface rippling like water. His reflection stared back at him, only it wasn't quite right. His own face was twisted in an unnatural way, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Something is wrong with that mirror, he thought, his body frozen in place. But as much as he wanted to tear his gaze away, he couldn't. The reflection shifted again, as though something was moving inside the glass. And then he saw it. A figure shrouded in darkness loomed behind him in the reflection. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like tattered robes. Its face was obscured, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, cold and empty. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward him through the mirror. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and his legs nearly gave out. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure's fingers brushed against the glass, and then, with a sudden, sharp crack, the mirror shattered. Shards of glass flew through the air, some embedding themselves into the wall, others crashing to the floor at his feet. Ethan stumbled back, heart pounding in his chest, eyes wide in disbelief. The room was empty now. The mirror had shattered, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything. But then, the whispers started again, this time louder, closer. Leave. It's coming for you. Ethan's eyes darted around the room. Something was moving behind him. He spun around, but again, nothing. The room was still. But the whispers, they weren't in his mind anymore. They were coming from behind him, from within the walls. He could hear the scraping sound again, the same nails on metal noise he had heard earlier in the basement. It was getting louder, faster, as though something was crawling toward him. He ran. No hesitation. No thought. Just pure, raw panic. He charged down the hall, nearly tripping over the stairs as he flew down them, the house groaning under his frantic movement. His breath came in gasps, and his chest felt tight, as though the air itself had become thick, pressing down on him. The front door was still locked. Still impossible to open. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. And through the haze of his fear, Ethan heard a voice, soft but clear, echoing from the walls. You cannot leave. Ethan's chest heaved with every ragged breath. His hands trembled, his mind racing to make sense of the madness he was trapped in. You cannot leave. The words echoed in his mind, deep and suffocating. The house, the walls themselves, seemed to close in around him, tightening their grip. He had to get out. But the door, the one thing that stood between him and freedom, would not budge. Frantically, he slammed his shoulder into the door, his heart pounding as he desperately tried to break through. But it was no use. It was as if the house itself had decided to keep him inside. The whispers grew louder, now not just from the walls, but from the very air around him. Ethan felt like he was drowning in them, each word a sharp, cold prick against his skin. They were in his ears, his mind, his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He stumbled back from the door, his hands pressed to his ears in a desperate attempt to block them out, but it didn't help. They were everywhere. They wouldn't stop. Leave. You should have left when you had the chance. Now you're ours. Ethan's legs shook, his body refusing to move as the weight of fear dragged him down. He was paralyzed, not by the darkness that surrounded him, but by the reality that the house was not just a house. It was alive. And it was hungry. A low, guttural growl rose from somewhere in the distance, breaking through the whispers. It was coming from the direction of the basement, the same place where the terror had first begun. The place where everything had started. Ethan could feel his body trembling, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. He turned toward the basement door, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape, but his feet moved toward it of their own accord. There was something down there, something waiting for him. It was no longer a choice. He had to go. He had to understand what was happening, or he would never escape. The basement was colder than before, the air thick with a damp, musty smell. The stairs creaked beneath Ethan's feet as he descended, each step a reminder of the danger waiting in the shadows. The growl was louder now, like an animal. No, something was stalking him from the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight flickered to life again, casting long, trembling beams of light that barely cut through the thick, oppressive darkness. The growling sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was almost unbearable. It wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from everywhere. Suddenly, the flashlight beam landed on something, a figure. But it wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, its form silhouetted against the far wall. It was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching out of proportion. Its body was covered in something slick, dark, and shiny, glistening in the dim light. But its face... Ethan's stomach churned when the light finally caught its face. The face wasn't a face at all. It was a blackened void, a smooth, featureless surface, as if it had never been human. But from within the darkness of the void, two eyes, deep, hollow, and malevolent, stared back at him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was stare into those eyes, feeling the weight of the creature's gaze pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. And then it spoke. "You should have stayed away." The voice was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. It wasn't human, but it wasn't inhuman either. It was the voice of something ancient, something born from the depths of the earth, something that had been waiting in the darkness for far too long. Ethan stumbled backward, his feet tripping over each other as he fought to get away. But the creature was too fast. It moved with terrifying speed, its limbs stretching and contorting in impossible ways as it reached for him. He ran, his legs burning with the effort, his heart pounding in his chest. But the basement seemed to stretch on forever, the exit nowhere in sight. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing him whole. The creature's growl rumbled through the air, the sound vibrating in his bones. Ethan turned a corner, praying for some escape, but what he found made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in images, dozens of them, scrawled in a language he didn't understand, but somehow he could feel the meaning behind them. Symbols. Warnings. A record of some unspeakable history that had been trapped in this house for years. As his flashlight flickered again, one image caught his attention. It was of the same figure he had just seen, its eyes staring out from the page, its mouth open in a scream of pure, unfiltered terror. And at the bottom of the drawing, written in a thick, bold hand, were the words, "It was never the house. It was always you." Ethan's head spun, and a cold realization gripped his heart. The house, the creature, the whispers, everything was connected. It was all tied to him. He wasn't just trapped in this place. This place was feeding off of him. His fear, his confusion, his terror. The creature's growl interrupted his thoughts, louder now, right behind him. He didn't have much time. With every ounce of strength, Ethan turned and bolted down the hallway, the growl growing louder, the sound of claws scraping against the stone walls of the basement echoing in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing: if he didn't find a way out soon, he would never leave this place alive. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he sprinted through the endless corridors of the house. His legs felt like they were made of lead, each step dragging him further into the maze of terror that had become his reality. The growl, the scratching sound, the whispers, they were all closing in on him. They weren't just sounds. They were the house itself, feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every second. His pulse thundered in his ears as he rounded another corner, his feet pounding against the wooden floors. Every turn he took only seemed to lead him deeper into the house, deeper into the nightmare that he couldn't escape. He could feel the air around him growing thicker, colder, the temperature dropping with every breath he took. And then, suddenly, the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And then the house plunged into total darkness. A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's forehead as he stood still, frozen in the blackness. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the world had paused, holding its breath. He couldn't see a thing. He couldn't hear a thing, save for his own racing heartbeat and the faint echo of his ragged breathing. And then, a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. A low, guttural sound, like something was speaking directly into his ear. "You're not alone." His stomach turned, his skin prickling with dread. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The house was alive, and it was hunting him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He stumbled forward, reaching out into the void, his fingers brushing against the walls for guidance. The house seemed to stretch around him, its walls growing longer, more oppressive, as though the darkness itself was closing in, tightening its grip around him. The growl was back, louder this time. It came from somewhere far off, but Ethan could feel it in the very pit of his stomach. It was getting closer. He had to move. He couldn't stay here, not in the dark, not with whatever it was hunting him. But the darkness wasn't just empty. It was alive. He could feel it, the subtle shift of something moving just out of sight, the distant scrape of claws against the floor, the unnatural press of air, as though something was standing right behind him. Snap. Ethan froze. He had heard it. The sound of something heavy, something massive, shifting behind him. It was unmistakable. Whatever was chasing him was closer than ever. He spun around, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched out before him, empty, silent. But his instinct screamed at him to move. Without thinking, he broke into a run, his feet pounding the wooden floors, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. The house had to have an end. It had to. There was no way it could stretch on forever. But as he ran, the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the house itself was closing in around him. The whispers came again, this time louder, clearer, as though they were coming from every direction. Turn around. The voice was low, soft, but insistent. Ethan's legs carried him forward, but his mind screamed at him to listen, to obey. He couldn't. He couldn't stop now. He was so close to finding an escape, to breaking free from this nightmare. He had to keep running. But the growl was right behind him now, echoing through the dark, rumbling like thunder. His skin crawled as the claws scraped against the floor again, closer than before. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He dared to glance over his shoulder. And there it was. The creature. It was moving quickly, too quickly, its limbs stretching and contorting in unnatural angles as it closed the gap between them. Its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared straight at him, its mouth open in a grotesque, silent scream. It didn't need to make a sound to terrify him. Its presence was enough. The very air around it seemed to distort, crackling with an unnatural energy. It was growing. The closer it got, the larger it became. Its limbs were elongating, stretching out like dark, twisted branches reaching for him. The shadows around it seemed to twist and writhe as though they were alive. Ethan's pulse raced as he pushed himself harder, desperate to escape. The creature's growl grew louder, vibrating through the air like a low, guttural rumble of thunder, shaking him to his core. His eyes darted around the hallway, searching for anything, a door, a window, a way out. He had to get away. But the creature was closing in fast, its form becoming more defined, more terrifying with every step. And then he saw it. A door. It wasn't much, just a simple wooden door at the end of the hallway, but it was enough. The light from his flashlight flickered in the distance, illuminating the door, offering him a sliver of hope. With every ounce of strength, Ethan surged forward, the creature's growls growing deafening as it followed close behind. His hand slammed against the door handle, but it was locked. Locked. He was going to die here, wasn't he? Trapped in this house, with nowhere to run. Click. The door swung open, and Ethan rushed inside without hesitation, the door slamming shut behind him. He pressed his back to the door, his breathing erratic, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, but it was something. It was a break in the endless darkness, the maddening maze of the house. For a moment, it was quiet. Then he heard it. A voice. Soft at first, but growing louder. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan's blood ran cold as the walls around him began to tremble. The whisper was coming from everywhere. The floor. The ceiling. The very air around him. He wasn't alone. Ethan's breath hitched as the voice echoed through the small room. "We've been waiting for you." The words seemed to come from the walls themselves, wrapping around him like a thick, suffocating fog. His pulse raced, and he backed toward the far corner, eyes darting around, searching for any escape. There was nowhere to run. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the room was closing in on him. A distant scratching sound broke the silence, growing louder, closer, until it filled the space. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was all around him. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the walls. Not again. His body tensed, and his legs trembled. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt tight. Whatever was behind that door was not human. It couldn't be. The way it moved, the way it seemed to grow stronger with every passing second, it was not something from this world. Then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then complete darkness. "You're not getting out," the voice whispered, "too close now." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, trying to find the source, but the shadows held him in place, paralyzed by fear. He heard the faintest shuffle of something moving in the darkness, just out of his reach. A cold hand brushed his neck. He froze. The growl was louder now, closer than ever. A scream caught in his throat as he felt someone behind him. And then, nothing. Complete silence. The shadows swallowed him whole. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing but a suffocating darkness. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. The air felt thick, heavier than before, as though the very atmosphere was pressing against him, trying to squeeze the life out of him. His fingers dug into the cold floor beneath him, desperate to feel something solid. Where was he? Was this still the house? He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. His limbs felt numb, as though he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't escape, a dream from which he couldn't wake. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten here, but something told him knew he was still not alone. A soft whisper broke through the silence. It was so quiet, so faint, that Ethan wasn't sure if it was real. It's not over. His blood ran cold. A rustling sound came from the corner of the room. Ethan's pulse surged, and he strained his ears, but there was nothing visible, nothing tangible. Just that dark, crushing weight around him. Then, suddenly, a sharp crack filled the air. Something had snapped, like bones breaking, the sound so loud it rattled his teeth. A shiver ran down his spine, and he tried to move again, but his body felt frozen in place. The only thing he could do was listen, helpless and paralyzed, as the darkness closed in on him. And then, the growl. It wasn't like the others. This one was deep, guttural, vibrating through his very bones. He could feel it inside him, a crawling sensation creeping under his skin. It was no longer in the distance. It was right there, so close he could almost touch it. The temperature dropped suddenly, as if the room itself had turned to ice. Ethan's breath came out in light puffs, his vision blurring as his body fought against the unnatural chill. He could feel something moving in the dark, something large, something monstrous, just beyond his reach. And then the whisper again. You can't hide. We're always here. The shadows shifted, and Ethan felt them close in on him like a vice. The growl was louder now, more insistent. Whatever it was circling him, watching, waiting. The floor beneath him creaked. Slowly, agonizingly, someone stepped closer, its footsteps echoing in the suffocating dark. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his whole body trembling. He could feel its presence, like a cold hand brushing against his soul. Then, he felt it, something icy, something sharp pressing against his neck. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. And then the voice again. This is where you belong. In that instant, the dark was not just around him, it was inside him. The coldness, the pain, the terror. It filled him, consumed him, until he couldn't tell where the house ended and he began. And then, it was quiet. Too quiet. His eyes slowly closed, but the darkness didn't fade. It pressed in, suffocating, endless. Ethan was never found. No trace of him remained, and the house stood in eerie silence, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in, just as it had waited for him. But those who entered the house never left.